back to Employment Insights with the NRTC. We're excited you joined us for this episode. Today, we're joined by our host, Sylvia Stinson-Perez, and our guest, Pat. Keep listening to hear about Pat's journey with an eye condition later in her career, her own challenges that arose from that, and her advice for others in a similar situation.
Welcome back to NRTC Employment Insights. And today I'm thrilled to be joined by Pat, who shares a work history with me. Pat is a retired social worker, and I worked as a social worker for a number of years. And so, Pat, welcome.
Hello. Thanks for asking me to be here.
Oh, thank you for being here. And we'll just jump right into the questions.
Okay.
Pat, share with us just a little bit about your vision loss journey. When did you get diagnosed? What could you see at that point? And, how did it impact your life?
Well, it would be over 20 years ago now. I was still driving, of course, and that was wonderful. I started to notice things related to driving in particular, and I would be driving along the road, and from my perspective, a car would suddenly leap out of a side street. What was happening, of course, with retinitis pigmentosa, with RP, is that your peripheral vision shrinks, and they were just suddenly appearing in my field of vision is what was happening. But as far as I was concerned, for some time, people were not being careful. They were leaping out of side streets without any respect for caution or me. So the other thing was that I had a couple of fender benders. I lived in a cul-de-sac, and I, would pull out to the main street. And when you have full vision, you don't really turn your entire head to the left or right to see what's coming. So I wasn't doing that. I would be glancing, but of course my glance was not taking in everything it needed to. And, I would pull out, and a couple of times I got dinged. Mm-hmm. So that was a clue to me that there was something going on, and I sort of offered myself up for an eye test, which I didn't have to do, but I did. And I went for an eye test and then for the peripheral field test, and discovered at that point that I was well on the way to losing my peripheral vision. And it was at about 60% at that time, which sounds glorious at this point. So I was sent to an ophthalmologist to a specialist to have a better look at my eyes. And he diagnosed me as having retinitis pigmentosa. And I asked at that moment, how long will I be able to drive, knowing that was something that would be affected? And he said, well, it's now. Like this minute, unless you go for a bioptics. So using the two eyes for the test, which I did and passed and scraped through driving for a couple more years. So driving was kind of the pivotal thing that it was giving me the clues, and that really set me on the path of understanding what was going on.
And, Pat, I will say that people with macular degeneration and glaucoma, and even to some extent diabetic retinopathy, report similar kinds of things. And, a couple of those, they might add reading into that too. But driving does tend to be, or getting around does tend to be, that first kind of clue for a lot of people who experience vision loss a little bบlater. So what kind of work were you doing at that time?
I was working as a social worker in a hospital setting in the capital city of Canada, in Ottawa, and working in physical rehabilitation. So I was working in a stroke program and a traumatic brain injury program. And over the course of the time after my diagnosis was also working as the clinical leader of the profession in that hospital. So when I was first diagnosed, I was a full-time social worker working with families and patients, dealing with loss and physical loss and all the emotional impacts of that. And sometimes, vision was affected by stroke, by brain injury. But that wasn't really on my radar as something which sort of relatable to me at that time, not initially anyway. It certainly did become more something that I became much more aware of, obviously. And then later, as the clinical leader, I was working part-time in frontline practice in the hospital and part-time as in a more administrative clinical practice role.
And that must have had some challenges, Pat, as you were experiencing progressive vision loss. And you've had, now have this, you have to get around a lot, moving to different areas, interacting with people. But then now you're also having to do paperwork and computer work. So what kind of tasks were specifically impacted by your vision loss? How was your job impacted?
Well, the paperwork, the sort of computer work, et cetera, as the clinical leader was actually easier because I had that, I had the central vision enough to be looking at a computer with fair, reasonable amount of ease. So that was not impacted. What was impacted was running meetings, for example, where I would be, the lead to organize and then run a meeting of, 20 social workers around a table. What I had to do was to sit these were long conference type tables. I would have to sit at the very end so that I could see the people to the right and left of the table. If I had been sitting at the long end of the table, I would have been having to move my head constantly back and forth to see who was there. And even as it was, the people to my immediate right and left, as time progressed, I started to lose actually awareness of them, and sometimes would even forget they were there because they were not in my field of vision. So I started losing people in meetings would be one thing, and finding it more difficult. If someone would put up their hand to speak, I wouldn't see it. Someone would speak and I would, not immediately know where the voice came from. I would have to start using voice recognition more often to know who was there. And all that creates a lot of anxiety, of course, when you're doing something that you've been doing very well, I thought, for a long time, and then suddenly you're having to pay such very great attention to these kinds of details. Where are people? Who's trying to speak? Who's not spoken? All those kinds of things were quite impacted. In terms of the patients and families, those that were sitting in front of me, yes, that was relatively easy too, because we were in a sort of static position. But over time, as my peripheral vision began to diminish, I would start to lose parts of their body, as it were. So a person sitting in front of me, I would see down to their knees when I had 60% peripheral vision. And eventually it would be that I lost their hands and then their elbows. And then, I would be left basically with just their head and shoulders. So working with a lot less information about how people were coping and, what their hands might be doing. Were they fidgeting? Were their feet tapping? All that information was lost. And again, having to rely much more on what they were saying and how they were sounding.
Yeah. And many different eye conditions like macular degenerations, et cetera, have peripheral loss in just different ways. So in macular, it's often the central vision. And so similar impacts, just different ways. In macular degeneration, you might not be recognizing faces, which can be just as much anxiety producing. So Pat, did you disclose your vision loss or that you were experiencing this vision impairment to your coworkers, to your supervisors? If so, how did you do it? How did they respond?
I kept pretty quiet for as long as I could, to be honest, for all the reasons that you might imagine, just not really accepting what was happening, that people weren't in many ways noticing. So the people I did disclose to were my colleagues first, I guess. At these meetings, I would let them know that I, wasn't always picking up what was going on in the room visually. And almost without exception, people would say, oh, I had no idea, or you do so well, or I didn't notice, or that sort of thing. To be fair, however, I didn't necessarily explain the condition. I didn't explain, I have been recently diagnosed with an eye condition called this, and these are the effects of it, which will progress over time. I would say sort of vague kind of things like, I don't see very well, or my vision is not that great now. So pretty vague kind of things, which understandably people maybe responded in vague kind of ways as well. So in terms of the people in sort of management, upper, beyond me positions, I did not disclose to them. No, I guess even though I knew I wasn't going to lose my job, there's always that sort of fear that you're going to be discriminated against, that there's going to be someone who's somehow going to say, oh, this person is, going blind. Why are they still here? Or this sort of thing. So there was that kind of, again, another layer of anxiety about keeping the job, despite the fact that there was no reason whatsoever to think that anything was going to happen. I was in a union, for one thing, and, I had excellent evaluations. There was nothing on the surface that would suggest that, but still it was an anxiety. So I kept pretty quiet. Until the kind of things that started happening more with patients, because in a hospital, lots of people with wheelchairs, which gradually disappeared again from my view. A person approaching me, or maybe sitting outside my office in a wheelchair, if I opened the door, there was a point at which unless I looked down, I didn't see them. So that started to get really scary. And then I started to say more.
Mm-hmm. And so how many years did you work past your diagnosis before you retired?
I worked full-time in that combination, frontline and practice leader, for 10 years. Mm-hmm. And then I retired and went back part-time frontline for 4 more years, so 14 years.
Okay. And so you just mentioned that you did start to say more. Knowing now what you know and just having the experience, if you could go back, would you have maybe disclosed earlier, asked for more accommodations? What would you have done differently? What would have helped you, I guess, is really what I'm asking is, would it have made the process easier if you had have asked for accommodations or even just been more open about it?
I think one thing I would have done would be to be more specific about what was happening rather than the sort of vague kind of statements I was making. Because, even now, if I say something in a store, somebody might, if I bump into somebody, I say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't see very well. Even if I have a cane with me, somebody just recently said, oh, yes, I need some new glasses as well, as if the things are equivalent. And this is even with a white cane in hand. So I think I would be more specific. I would just, for those who I thought would listen, and who needed to know, I would explain the condition, what happens, and that it's not static, that it's progressive, and that things will get, more challenging, and that they should be aware of that, and that I may be asking for some, changes to my workstation, my office, the way I interact with patients. I might ask for the patients to be brought to me more frequently rather than going to their rooms, those kinds of things. I think would have been more specific, and I think that would have been more helpful to other people as well. So
towards the end, when you really were experiencing more significant vision loss, did you ask for those kinds of accommodations? And did you ever get any training while you were still working, such as in orientation and mobility, or with assistive technology or anything?
No, Sylvia, nothing. I'm sorry. I didn't do any of those things. I was still in denial and just, no, I can manage. I can pass, Mm-hmm. I can pass as a sighted person, and that's the way I want it right now. So I did that right up to I left my job rather than look for accommodations. So I was at retirement age. Because it was possible to retire, I had that option. Mm-hmm. Had I been younger, even 10 years younger, I would have been forced either to go on disability or to really just kind of come to grips with things in a much more significant way. The cane training and the mobility training that I've done have all been since I retired at 64. Mm-hmm. And even, what I did, in a hospital, I was working with physios and OTs. So the OTs in particular, and, a couple of them were my good friends, were very helpful in sort of, in an informal way, at talking to me about scanning, mm-hmm. about, staying close to the walls rather than trying to walk down the middle of the hallways, which were quite wide. So I couldn't see both sides of them eventually. So that's what I would do. So I get some informal advice from occupational therapists that I worked with. Keep close to the edge. Stop if anybody's coming. Let them pass first. Don't try and sort of, jiggle your way around them. Let other people pass first. Scan, constantly scanning is the other thing. Mm-hmm. And so
I have to tell you, Pat, that everything you told me is very typical. I was the same way. And I just was much younger when I experienced enough vision loss that I had to ask for accommodations and learn skills. But that is very typical. And what I find, as a vision rehab therapist myself, and having worked with many, many clients over the years, is that people develop their own adaptations, just like you're talking about. Those are the kinds of things that I think we naturally figure out in some ways too. And when we can have other people around us to tell us those things too, that's great. But many people start adapting probably even without realizing it. You were probably starting to do some of those things before you even realized it. So.
Yes. One of the things that, a friend told me was that, in the last several years, is that I was not looking at people as much as I used to. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's another thing now that I try and be very careful of, like in a grocery store in the line, I can see a face. So I try and make sure to, say thank you and have a good day, but looking at the person and not at the ground, because the ground is the ground is where the dangers are generally.
Yeah. That's so true. So great.
So keeping an eye on the ground is important, but engaging with people and really looking at them as you're talking with them is also important. But it's an effort. It's an effort.
And even when you can't see them anymore, it's still important. So my next question is, and I realized that you didn't have quote, blindness skills, but what do you believe are the skills that really helped you continue to work? That what gave you that ability to continue to work?
Well, I mean, my motivation to be employed, I was an older parent, so I had a child I was supporting. So there was, no way I was going to not work. So, the idea of not working never entered my head. So it was, how am I going to figure this out? I have to make a living. I want to work, and I have a child to support. So those were the sort of, I would say, the major motivations. What helped me, I guess, would be my partner and my music. I'm very involved in music, so that kind of kept me going. And a church community. Those would be the things that kept me going.
Okay.
So those
Awesome.
kind of supports.
Great.
Supports. So personal support networks of some kind. Connecting with the blind, visually impaired sort of community has again been something very recent, and connecting through the Daring Sisters was definitely a kind of an important step for me. So though I'm not connected in Canada, I'm more connected with the group in the States. But that's been an important group for me too. So making sure that you are surrounded by people who are willing to kind of go on that journey with you and accommodate with you, because it's not just us, it's the people we work with, or the people that care about us, who are also impacted.
That's so true, Pat. So true.
Yeah.
So attitude and that support system. That's great. That's excellent.
Yeah, definitely. And having something that is kind of something that's keeping you going personally. What is it for you that's kind of keeping you motivated to stay in the game, to stay working? Do you need the money? Have you got, people who are counting on you? What is it that's, or do you really enjoy your work? Is there a way of adapting your work? Can you become a different kind of could I become a different kind of social worker? If I think now, I could have, there are other things I could have done employment-wise. I could have gone into private practice, and I could have worked, and gone into private practice specializing in disability or vision loss, but I didn't do those things. Had I been younger, maybe, and I would have had to face up a little more quickly, and maybe I would have done that. Maybe I would have sort of moved my work into a field that was more accessible for me.
That's great. So finally, what advice would you give someone? And I think you've said some really brilliant things, Pat, really brilliant things. And I appreciate the authenticity too. But a final thing is, my question would be, what advice would you give someone who, like you, later in their life, or later in their career, I should say, not really later in life, later in your career, experiences significant vision loss that impacts their work? What are some pieces of advice you would give?
Let me see. Take a deep breath and kind of try and look at the situation square on as much as you can. It's not easy, and it often comes in bits and pieces, but try to be open to what is happening, understand it, seek out the resources that you feel at your stage in the journey that you can accept and live with, but try and be aware of what the journey might look like and where you are on in it, sort of on that continuum. If you're at the beginning of the journey and you still have reasonable vision, don't sort of push it aside. Try and keep in your awareness that this really is a life-altering change or understanding, and that don't give up, just don't give up. Life doesn't end. Life doesn't end with this. It feels like it at certain points, but it really doesn't. And really seek out a community, seek out people that are willing to support you. If you're in a sort of a relationship where the person is just sort of discounting what you're saying, or is not going to be helpful, then think about what that means in your life. Try and educate people. People just don't get it often. They really just don't get it, especially if they see you walking around without a cane and crashing into things. But but if people need more information than we imagine to begin to understand what you're experiencing, and even then, it's often hard for people to really get it. So let people know what you're
That's
going through.
awesome. Yeah, that's so true. So explain things to people the best you can, and understand that it is very difficult for people. And I would also just add is that, seek out training, get orientation and mobility, learn assistive technology. All of those things can make life so much easier.
Yes.
So much easier.
Yeah. And I have done that. I have spoken with the tech specialist for the CNIB, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind here. So then that person was extremely helpful. So there are things out there. You just got to find them and be persistent. Go at your own pace, but don't be dragged down by your own pace either.
That's wonderful, Pat. Thank you so much for taking your time out to share about your experiences. And I always love speaking to my fellow social workers. So thank you so much.
That's my great pleasure. Thank you for asking me.